The basic function of the HTML helper is to generate code that is well formatted and used often. The HTML helper helps us with those tags that we often forget the syntax to. For example, when we include a style sheet, we know it's a link tag, but does that link tag take an attribute of the href for the source file or the src for the source file? And for those of you wondering, it is the href. The HTML helper has a lot of helpful methods, but in this segment we're only going to cover the CSS method, image method, and the script method. We will cover the basics of each of these methods. Here's a link to the HTML helpers page on cakephp.org. You'll find a comprehensive list of all of the methods that are provided in the HTML helper class. In the HTML helper CSS method, it has been updated in the 2.4 version, which is the current version that you can retrieve at the time of this recording. This particular method will not work with the current PHP version that we are working with. We are currently working with the 2.3 version. If you have the 2.3 version installed, please refer to the segment on views earlier in this module on how to call the CSS method in the HTML helper class. The information below will be for the 2.4 version. This takes one or two parameters. The first parameter is necessary, and the second parameter is optional. For the first parameter, you can provide a CSS file name, or you can provide an array of CSS file names. These file names are relative to the app webroot CSS folder. So for example, if we wanted to include just one style sheet, we would type this, HTML, then our CSS method, and the parameter we're passing in is the style sheet name. We do not need to include the file extension. If we wanted to pass in multiple style sheets, we would use the same CSS method, but as our parameter we would just pass in an array, and inside that array we would have the file names of each individual style sheet we would like to pull in. Again, the file extension is not needed. Here's an example of the output from these particular CSS method calls. Next is the HTML helper image. It takes two different parameters. The first one is a string path to the image. This is relative to the app webroot img folder. The second, which is an optional associated array of options, which are HTML attributes. For our example, we're going to pass in both parameters. So we're going to have this, HTML, image, and then you'll see our first parameter is the image that we want to display with the file extension, and our second parameter is an array of HTML attributes. In this case, we're passing in a key of alt being the HTML attribute that we want to set, and the value that we want to set it to. This call will output the following code. As you can see, the alt tag is set. The last method we're going to cover is the HTML helper script. It's basically similar to the CSS method in the HTML helper class. It can take two different parameters. The first one is a string to a single JS file or an array of JS files, exactly like the CSS method. Now these files are relative to the app webroot JS folder. Now, unlike the CSS method, it will allow for directories outside of the webroot.js folder, and it can also take a path to a remote URL. The second parameter is an optional associated array of options, basically HTML attributes. We will only focus on the first parameter of this script method. So for example, we have this, HTML, and then our script method, and we are passing in as our parameter the name of our JS file without the file extension. Now if we wanted to include a script file that was not in the webroot.js folder, we would use a relative path based off of the webroot directory. So in this case, our scripts file would be in webroot/new JS directory. Our third example covers the remote URL. In this case, we would need to include the file extension. Here's the output from our first example. Using the HTML helper class will save time as you create your website.